The notification arrived at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, buzzing against the mahogany desk of a 19-year-old who controlled more medical technology patents than most countries. 72 hours. That's all Connor Morrison had left to prove his grandfather could communicate meaningfully, or watch 60% of a $2.3 billion inheritance disappear into a charitable foundation he'd never heard of. The old man hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, not since the massive stroke left him trapped behind eyes that still recognized everything but couldn't form the bridge between thought and speech. 15 professional caregivers had tried and failed, each leaving behind detailed reports explaining why Samuel Morrison's condition was irreversible. The neurologist's evaluation equipment was already being wheeled into the Buckhead mansion on Peachtree Road, and Connor was running out of both time and hope. But Rosa Martinez, the new housekeeper he'd hired just 1 week earlier through a desperate Craigslist ad, was organizing his grandfather's medication bottles in a way that made no logical sense to anyone who'd been watching. Instead of alphabetical order or dosage schedules like every previous caregiver had used, she was arranging them by the sound they made when shaken. She'd been in the house for exactly 6 days, moving through the mansion's 34 rooms with quiet efficiency, and Connor was starting to notice things about his grandfather's behavior that he'd never seen before. The inheritance clause had seemed like a minor formality when his parents died in that private jet crash over the Chattahoochee River 18 months ago. Take care of Grandpa Samuel for 90 consecutive days, demonstrate some basic family responsibility, then step into full control of MedTech Dynamics and its 12,000 employees across 4 continents. The law firm of Patterson, Bradley and Associates had explained it as Connor's grandmother Rose's final wish, a codicil added to the family trust after her death 5 years earlier. She'd witnessed too many wealthy Atlanta families abandon their aging relatives to institutional care, and she wasn't about to let that pattern repeat in her own bloodline. But nobody had expected Samuel's condition to deteriorate so rapidly after Connor's parents' funeral, or for a 19-year-old business heir to struggle this dramatically with something that should have been simple companionship. The old man had been sharp as a surgical scalpel right up until that April morning when he woke up unable to say his own name. The blood clot had stolen his ability to translate thoughts into words, while leaving his comprehension completely intact, creating a prison of silence around a mind that remained fully aware of its own limitations. Samuel Morrison had built MedTech Dynamics from absolutely nothing, starting in a converted Marietta garage in 1962 with patents for cardiac monitoring equipment that actually kept people alive, instead of just beeping reassuringly. By the time he handed operational control to Connor's father in 1994, they were manufacturing medical devices that powered intensive care units from Grady Hospital to facilities in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. The company's neural monitoring systems had revolutionized stroke recovery protocols worldwide, which made Samuel's own condition feel like a cruel cosmic joke that nobody in the family discussed openly. The speech therapists had attempted everything that conventional rehabilitation medicine could offer. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Marcus Stroke Network had implemented flashcards with high-contrast pictures, repetitive syllable exercises, medication adjustments targeting brain chemistry, and even experimental transcranial electrical stimulation that required Samuel to wear a device that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Each new professional had arrived with genuine confidence and departed with apologetic explanations, detailed billing statements, and referrals to the next specialist who might succeed where evidence-based medicine had encountered its limits. The pattern had become depressingly predictable over 36 months of failed interventions. Initial consultation filled with cautious optimism, followed by 6 to 8 weeks of structured therapy sessions that produced microscopic improvements, quickly followed by plateaus that stretched into permanent limitations. Gradual frustration would creep into the therapist's voice during progress meetings, leading to polite resignation disguised as clinical realism and recommendations for palliative care rather than continued rehabilitation efforts. Samuel would cooperate fully during each therapy session, following instructions with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was being asked of him. But afterward, he would retreat into complete silence, his intelligent eyes holding depths of frustration that had no outlet for expression. Connor had watched this cycle repeat 15 times, each failure adding another layer to his grandfather's visible despair and his own growing sense of helplessness in the face of medical expertise that consistently fell short of meaningful results. Connor had inherited far more than money, patents, and corporate responsibility when his parents' Cessna Citation went down in a thunderstorm that April evening. He'd inherited the crushing weight of his grandfather's silence and his own complete ignorance about how to bridge the gap between a brilliant mind and a damaged communication system. The MedTech Dynamics Board of Directors, led by Chairman Robert Kellerman, was already questioning Connor's readiness to guide a company whose innovations affected millions of patients worldwide. And failing this fundamental test of personal caregiving wouldn't strengthen his position. The corporate attorneys had made the legal situation crystal clear during a conference room meeting that lasted 4 uncomfortable hours. Demonstrate measurable competence in providing personal care for a disabled family member, or face an immediate legal challenge to his fitness for executive leadership based on the precedent that someone who couldn't manage individual human needs shouldn't control systems affecting thousands of lives. It was a test designed by a grandmother who'd understood that managing people's welfare required skills that couldn't be learned from Harvard Business School case studies or McKinsey consulting reports. Rosa Martinez had appeared at exactly the right moment, responding to a hastily written Craigslist advertisement for domestic help that Connor's executive assistant had posted in something approaching panic. The previous housekeeper, Mrs. Patricia Chen, had quit after exactly 14 days, claiming that Samuel's constant silence was psychologically unnerving and that the mansion felt haunted by conversations that would never happen. Rosa's resume was remarkably thin for someone applying to work in a Buckhead estate worth $8 million, just 3 years of cleaning medical offices in Decatur, and a character reference from Mount Olive Baptist Church, where she sang in the choir every Sunday. But Rosa had shown up for the interview precisely on time, wearing a simple blue dress that had been carefully pressed and shoes that had been polished despite their obvious age. She'd listened to Connor's explanation of Samuel's condition without asking the usual questions about salary, benefits, or time off. Instead, she'd inquired about his dietary preferences, medication schedule, mobility limitations, and whether he showed preferences for particular times of day when he seemed more alert or responsive. Then she'd asked to meet Samuel directly, which no previous job candidate had requested. The 15-minute interaction between Rosa and Samuel had been unlike anything Connor had observed during months of medical consultations. Rosa had introduced herself clearly, explained that she would be helping maintain the household, and asked Samuel's permission to organize his personal spaces in ways that might be more comfortable for him. Samuel had nodded once, the first clear response Connor had seen him make to a stranger in over a year. Rosa had accepted the job immediately, asking only whether she could start the following Monday and whether Connor had any objections to her bringing fresh flowers for the rooms where Samuel spent most of his time. If this moment hit you, tap like. It helps more people find these stories. The first significant change Rosa implemented was repositioning the living room furniture in a way that initially struck Connor as completely arbitrary. He returned home from a particularly brutal med-tech board meeting on Thursday afternoon to discover his grandfather's wheelchair had been moved from its usual spot facing the 75-inch Samsung television to an entirely different angle that pointed toward the baby grand piano that had sat untouched since the stroke. Samuel was sitting straighter than Connor had seen in months, his spine properly aligned against the wheelchair's back support, his fingers moving in subtle patterns against the leather armrest that looked almost like he was playing invisible melodies on invisible keys. When Connor questioned Rosa about the furniture rearrangement, she offered a simple explanation about afternoon lighting being more beneficial from that particular angle, then continued her methodical dusting of the bookshelf that contained Samuel's collection of jazz biographies and music theory textbooks. But Connor found himself studying those finger movements with growing fascination. His grandfather had been an accomplished pianist before World War II, talented enough to play weekend gigs with swing bands around Atlanta's Five Points district while building his first medical equipment business during the week. The Steinway Model M had been his pride and joy, a 1947 model that he'd purchased with his first significant business profit and maintained in perfect condition for over 70 years. Rosa had opened the piano's fall board. On the same day, she rearranged the furniture, revealing keys that gleamed despite 3 years of neglect. Samuel's eyes had been fixed on those keys with an intensity that Connor hadn't seen since before the stroke, and his finger movements seemed to correspond to specific chord progressions that Connor vaguely recognized from memories of childhood visits when his grandfather would play after Sunday dinners. The connection between Rosa's seemingly random furniture placement and Samuel's sudden alertness was becoming impossible to ignore. The medication organization system Rosa had developed was equally mysterious but increasingly effective as Connor observed its daily implementation. She wasn't just sorting pills by sound. She was carefully watching Samuel's physical responses to each container and adjusting their placement based on what generated positive, neutral, or negative reactions. The heart medication in its amber plastic bottle made Samuel's shoulders tense visibly whenever Rosa reached for it. The blood thinner caused no observable response at all, but the small bottle of omega-3 supplements made Samuel's breathing deepen slightly, and Rosa had positioned that container where he could see it clearly throughout the daily routine. Rosa was reading behavioral signals that everyone else, including Connor and 15 medical professionals, had either missed entirely or dismissed as irrelevant to treatment planning. She was treating Samuel like someone whose preferences and responses mattered, rather than like a passive recipient of care whose opinions were no longer accessible. The approach seemed almost ridiculously simple, but its effects on Samuel's overall demeanor were becoming undeniable to anyone paying attention to details rather than just clinical outcomes. By Friday morning, Rosa had begun humming while she worked, filling the mansion's rooms with jazz standards from the 1940s that drifted through the air like audio memories of a time when Samuel's world had been full of music and possibility. Connor caught his grandfather's head turning toward the sound with movements that were subtle but unmistakably intentional. The old man's breathing pattern changed when Rosa hummed Moonlight Serenade, becoming deeper and more rhythmic, synchronized with the melody in ways that suggested some level of cognitive engagement that previous caregivers had failed to activate. Samuel's finger movements against the wheelchair armrest became significantly more pronounced when Rosa hummed, following chord progressions that matched the song's harmonic structures with precision that couldn't be coincidental. Connor realized he was witnessing muscle memory that had survived the stroke intact, preserved pathways that connected musical pattern recognition to physical response, even when verbal communication remained completely blocked. The implications were staggering if Rosa was right about what she seemed to be observing. Connor confronted Rosa the following Saturday morning while she was organizing the kitchen pantry with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized everything she did. He'd expected to hire someone who would dust surfaces and vacuum carpets, not someone who would conduct amateur neurological assessments of his grandfather's cognitive function. But when Connor pressed Rosa for a detailed explanation of her methods, her response stopped every objection he'd been preparing to voice. Rosa Martinez had earned a Bachelor of Music Therapy degree from Georgia State University in 2019, graduating summa cum laude with specialized training in neurological rehabilitation and post-stroke communication recovery. She'd completed 3 years of clinical experience working with stroke patients at Grady Memorial Hospital's rehabilitation wing, developing expertise in using musical interventions to stimulate damaged neural pathways and restore functional communication abilities in patients whose conditions had been considered medically hopeless by conventional standards. She'd taken the housekeeping position not because she lacked qualifications for therapeutic work, but because music therapy positions in Atlanta required expensive continuing education credits and professional liability insurance that she couldn't afford while supporting 2 young children as a single mother after her husband's death in a construction accident 2 years earlier. Her student loan payments consumed nearly 40% of her income, and therapy jobs that paid enough to cover both living expenses and professional requirements were scarce in a healthcare system that viewed music therapy as optional rather than essential. Rosa had recognized Samuel's preserved musical processing abilities within hours of meeting him, but she'd maintained professional boundaries appropriate to her official role as domestic help rather than licensed therapist. She'd been unconsciously applying therapeutic principles while performing housekeeping duties because her training had become instinctive after years of clinical practice. But she hadn't wanted to overstep her employment boundaries by offering medical opinions that Connor hadn't requested from someone he'd hired to clean bathrooms and organize closets. The revelation hit Connor like ice water thrown in his face on a hot Atlanta summer day. He'd hired someone with exactly the clinical expertise his grandfather desperately needed, but his own assumptions about social class, professional credentials, and the kinds of work that different people were qualified to perform had completely blinded him to Rosa's actual capabilities. Rosa had been treating her employment as housekeeping work, because that's precisely what Connor's advertisement had specified. But she'd been unconsciously implementing evidence-based therapeutic interventions the entire time because her professional training had become second nature. The furniture arrangement hadn't been arbitrary. It was optimal positioning for musical engagement based on established protocols for patients with language processing disorders. The medication organization wasn't random. It was systematic desensitization designed to reduce anxiety responses that could interfere with cognitive function. The humming wasn't casual background noise. It was carefully selected auditory stimulation at frequencies and rhythms known to activate preserved neural pathways in stroke patients with Samuel's specific type of brain damage. Connor asked Rosa to abandon the pretense of being just a housekeeper and apply her full professional expertise to his grandfather's condition. The court-appointed neurologist's evaluation was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 p.m., giving them exactly 62 hours to demonstrate meaningful improvement in Samuel's communication abilities. But Rosa was hesitant to make promises about outcomes, warning Connor that legitimate progress in music therapy was typically measured in months rather than days, and that the artificial pressure of a legal deadline could actually interfere with the patient trust and environmental control that successful intervention required. Connor didn't have months to work with. He had less than 3 days to produce evidence of meaningful communication, or watch his grandfather's silence cost them both everything they had left of family legacy and financial security. The inheritance clause wasn't just about money. It represented his grandmother's final test of whether Connor possessed the emotional intelligence and personal commitment necessary to lead a company whose decisions affected human lives on a massive scale. But Rosa agreed to implement a systematic intervention protocol based on her clinical training, with the understanding that results couldn't be guaranteed under such compressed timeframes and artificial pressure. She outlined an approach that would focus on rebuilding connections between Samuel's preserved musical memory systems and his compromised language centers, using techniques that had shown success in similar cases when applied with patience and consistency over extended periods. The systematic approach Rosa implemented beginning Sunday morning was unlike anything Connor had witnessed during the parade of previous medical interventions. Instead of demanding speech production as the primary goal, Rosa focused on re-establishing the neurological connections between Samuel's intact musical processing abilities and his damaged language systems. Every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, she positioned his wheelchair at the precise angle to the piano that had generated his strongest responses, placed his coffee in the specific ceramic mug he'd always preferred, not the institutional plastic cups that other caregivers had used for safety reasons, and began playing simple melodies on the keyboard. Samuel's initial responses were barely detectable to casual observation, but Rosa documented every micro-movement with the precision of someone who understood that therapeutic progress often began with changes so subtle that untrained observers would dismiss them as meaningless. A slight nod when Rosa played Dave Brubeck's Take 5, finger-tapping that synchronized with the syncopated rhythm of Blue Moon, eye movements that tracked Rosa's hands across the piano keys with focus that hadn't been present during any previous caregiver interactions. Rosa adjusted every variable based on what generated the strongest responses from Samuel. She experimented with different times of day, discovering that his musical responsiveness peaked between 9 and 11 in the morning when his energy levels were highest. She tested various key signatures, finding that songs played in the keys of C major and A minor produced more consistent finger movements than other musical intervals. She monitored room temperature, humidity, lighting conditions, and even the specific chair positioning that optimized Samuel's comfort and attention span. Connor found himself taking detailed notes during these sessions, learning to recognize patterns in his grandfather's behavior that had been invisible to him throughout 3 years of conventional medical treatment. He watched Samuel's facial expressions change subtly when Rosa played familiar songs, saw his breathing synchronize with musical rhythms, observed finger movements that followed chord progressions with accuracy that couldn't be explained by random muscle contractions or coincidental timing. The first major breakthrough occurred Monday morning at 9:43 a.m., 31 hours before the scheduled neurological evaluation. Rosa was playing Georgia on My Mind in the key of C major when Samuel's mouth began moving in ways that weren't related to swallowing or breathing. His lips were following the melody's phrasing, his tongue positioning itself for consonants that weren't quite emerging as sounds. But the intention to vocalize was unmistakable for the first time since his stroke. Rosa immediately stopped playing the melody and shifted to a simpler song from Samuel's youth, something he would have heard thousands of times during the 1940s when his musical interests were forming. All of Me played slowly in a key that matched his natural vocal range before the stroke damaged his speech production capabilities. Samuel's mouth continued moving, and this time a sound emerged. Not a word, but a vocalization with recognizable pitch and intentional rhythm that corresponded to the melody Rosa was playing. The process of building from sound to syllable required 2 hours of patient repetition with frequent breaks to prevent fatigue and frustration that could undermine progress. Rosa would play a short phrase, wait for Samuel's response, then repeat the sequence with minor variations until she found the combination of tempo, key, and rhythm that generated the clearest vocalization. Connor watched his grandfather work harder at communication than he'd seen in 3 years, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of coordinating breath control, tongue placement, and vocal cord function that most people performed unconsciously. Syllable to word required another 4 hours spread across the entire day, with breaks for meals, rest periods, and the normal household routines that prevented the intervention from becoming overwhelming or artificial. Rosa understood that sustainable progress required maintaining Samuel's sense of dignity and normalcy, rather than turning every interaction into a clinical exercise that might trigger performance anxiety or resistance to continued effort. By Monday evening at 6:15 p.m., Connor heard his grandfather say Rose clearly enough that a stranger would understand the word without context or repetition. Not Rosa's name, but the name of Connor's grandmother, Samuel's beloved wife of 47 years, who had died while Connor was away at Phillips Exeter Academy, too focused on his own teenage concerns to understand the depth of his grandfather's loss. The single word carried emotional weight that transcended its simple phonetic structure. Samuel had been looking directly at his wife's photograph on the piano when he spoke her name, his eyes focusing on her face with recognition and longing that had been trapped inside his mind for 3 years of silence. The word represented not just recovered speech function, but the restoration of emotional expression that connected Samuel's inner world to external reality in ways that conventional therapy had never approached. But the timing created an immediate crisis that threatened to undermine everything Rosa had accomplished. Dr. Patricia Williams, the court-appointed neurologist whose evaluation would determine Samuel's legal competency and Connor's inheritance status, was scheduled to arrive Tuesday at 2 p.m. for assessments that would be conducted under formal conditions very different from the supportive environment Rosa had carefully constructed for Samuel's breakthrough. One clearly spoken word, even with obvious emotional significance, might not satisfy the legal standard for meaningful communication that the inheritance clause required. The evaluation would need to demonstrate that Samuel could respond to questions, express preferences, and engage in reciprocal conversation that proved his cognitive function remained intact despite his communication limitations. Rosa had achieved remarkable progress in just 2 days, but the artificial pressure of legal scrutiny could easily trigger performance anxiety that might cause Samuel to retreat into the protective silence that had become his default response to stressful situations. Rosa had a plan for the evaluation that was either clinically brilliant or professionally desperate, depending on how much faith Connor was willing to place in someone whose expertise he'd almost overlooked entirely. She proposed recreating the exact environmental conditions that had produced Monday's breakthrough, but within the formal evaluation structure that Dr. Williams would require for legal documentation. The approach would mean revealing Rosa's true qualifications and clinical methods to medical professionals who might question her credentials or dismiss music therapy as unscientific compared to conventional rehabilitation approaches. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently here. I actually read them. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of humid heat that made Atlanta summers legendary for their oppressive discomfort. Connor woke at 5:30 a.m. with his stomach twisted in knots that had nothing to do with the coffee he hadn't been able to drink. The evaluation setup looked like something between a medical examination and a legal proceeding, with recording equipment, standardized assessment forms, and witnesses that transformed the familiar living room into an intimidating clinical environment that bore no resemblance to the supportive space where Samuel had found his voice just 18 hours earlier. Dr. Patricia Williams arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a court stenographer named Margaret Thompson and a witness from the Fulton County Probate Court whose job was ensuring that the evaluation met legal standards for competency determination. Connor's corporate attorneys participated via secured video conference from the Patterson, Bradley and Associates office downtown. their presence adding another layer of formal scrutiny that made everyone in the room acutely aware of the financial stakes involved in Samuel's performance. The dining room had been converted into a sterile testing environment with medical equipment, legal documents, and recording devices that would capture every word Samuel spoke or failed to speak during the next 2 hours. The formal setup was designed to ensure objective documentation, but Connor could see his grandfather's shoulders tensing as strangers filled the house with clipboards, cameras, and the kind of clinical atmosphere that had accompanied every failed therapy attempt over the past 3 years. But Rosa had spent the early morning hours transforming the living room into something entirely different. Samuel's wheelchair was positioned at the exact angle that had generated his strongest responses during the previous day's breakthrough. The piano bench was adjusted to the precise height that allowed optimal hand positioning for musical demonstration. Connor's grandmother's photograph sat on the piano, where Samuel could see Rose's face clearly, surrounded by the familiar objects and environmental cues that had supported his communication attempts. Even the room's lighting had been adjusted to match the conditions present during Monday's success, with specific window blinds opened to create the same patterns of natural illumination that had been present when Samuel first spoke his wife's name. Rosa understood that recreating therapeutic breakthroughs meant controlling every variable that might have contributed to the original success, no matter how minor those factors might seem to people unfamiliar with the complexities of neurological rehabilitation. Dr. Williams began her evaluation with standardized protocols that had been developed for assessing cognitive function in stroke patients. She asked Samuel to respond to basic commands like raising his right hand, closing his eyes, and pointing to specific objects around the room. Samuel performed all physical tasks perfectly, demonstrating that his comprehension and motor control remained intact. But when Dr. Williams asked him to respond verbally to simple questions about his name, age, and location, the room filled with the same devastating silence that had characterized every previous medical assessment. Connor watched his grandfather's eyes dart between Dr. Williams' face and the recording equipment, recognizing the familiar pattern of anxiety that had sabotaged so many therapeutic attempts over the past 3 years. Samuel understood exactly what was being asked of him, but the formal medical environment was triggering the same performance pressure that had consistently prevented him from demonstrating his actual capabilities. The evaluation was failing in precisely the same way that 15 previous assessments had failed, despite Rosa's breakthrough just hours earlier. After 30 minutes of conventional testing that produced no verbal responses whatsoever, Dr. Williams turned to Rosa with the politely skeptical expression of someone who had witnessed dozens of family members grasp at false hope based on wishful thinking rather than clinical evidence. She agreed to observe Rosa's alternative approach with the professional tolerance of someone who understood that desperate families often convinced themselves they'd witnessed improvements that existed only in their imagination. But as Rosa moved Samuel from the formal evaluation setup to his preferred position in the living room, the atmosphere in the house shifted dramatically. The clinical tension that had filled the air during Dr. Williams's standardized testing began to dissipate as Rosa implemented the carefully controlled environment that had produced Monday's communication breakthrough. Samuel's breathing deepened, his shoulders relaxed, and his fingers began the subtle movements against his wheelchair armrest that Connor had learned to recognize as signs of musical engagement. Rosa began playing the same melody that had triggered Samuel's first vocalization 24 hours earlier. Georgia on My Mind filled the room with familiar harmonies that seemed to activate something in Samuel's neurological system that formal medical testing had been unable to access. Dr. Williams stopped taking notes on her standardized assessment forms and leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting from professional detachment to clinical curiosity as she observed Samuel's response to musical stimulation. The first sound came exactly 12 minutes into Rosa's demonstration, a vocalization that matched both the pitch and rhythm of the melody she was playing. Dr. Williams asked her to stop the music and repeat the stimulus without instrumental support, testing whether Samuel's response was dependent on musical accompaniment or could be produced independently. The room fell silent for nearly a full minute before Samuel whispered, "Rose," again, softer than the previous day, but still clearly intelligible to everyone present. Rosa continued with the systematic approach she'd developed, playing familiar melodies and providing the environmental supports that had proven effective during private sessions. Over the next 45 minutes, Samuel produced 6 distinct words: Rose, Connor, home, music, thank you, and surprisingly, doctor. Each word required specific prompting and optimal conditions, but all were clearly understandable to objective observers who had no previous experience with Samuel's communication attempts. More importantly, from a legal perspective, each word demonstrated contextual understanding and appropriate emotional connection. When Samuel said Connor while looking directly at his grandson, when he said home while gesturing around the familiar living room, when he said thank you while making eye contact with Rosa, he was providing evidence of meaningful communication that went far beyond simple sound production, to demonstrate genuine cognitive engagement with his environment and relationships. Dr. Williams concluded her evaluation with cautious professional optimism tempered by clinical realism. Samuel's speech production remained severely limited compared to normal function, and his communication abilities were entirely dependent on specific environmental supports that might not be available in all settings. However, he had demonstrated functional verbal abilities that hadn't been present during any previous neurological assessments over the past 3 years, representing measurable improvement that met legal standards for meaningful communication. The improvement was thoroughly documented through audio recordings, witnessed by multiple independent observers, and legally sufficient to satisfy the inheritance requirements that had triggered the evaluation. But more importantly, for Connor's understanding of the situation, he had witnessed something that fundamentally changed his conception of what competence looked like, and who was qualified to recognize it when conventional expertise had failed completely. The conversation with Rosa that evening revealed layers of professional judgment and clinical expertise that Connor was only beginning to appreciate after months of assuming she was simply someone who cleaned houses for wealthy families. Rosa had identified Samuel's preserved musical memory systems within the first day of employment, but she'd also recognized that premature intervention might trigger the same performance anxiety that had limited every previous therapeutic attempt. Her systematic approach had been designed specifically to build Samuel's confidence through small successes, rather than highlight his deficits through repeated failures. Every element of the breakthrough, from furniture positioning to song selection to timing of interventions, had been orchestrated with clinical precision that was disguised as routine domestic activity to avoid creating pressure that might undermine therapeutic progress. Connor offered Rosa a permanent position as Samuel's full-time care coordinator, with a salary that reflected her actual qualifications rather than his initial assumptions about her professional capabilities. The offer included health insurance, continuing education support, and recognition as a key member of the family's medical team rather than domestic staff. But Rosa had ideas that extended far beyond individual caregiving to applications that could benefit other families facing similar challenges. Rosa proposed documenting Samuel's recovery process and developing it into a pilot program that could integrate music therapy principles into standard rehabilitation protocols used by MedTech Dynamics healthcare partners. The success they'd achieved could be studied, refined, and potentially replicated with other stroke patients whose conditions had been dismissed as hopeless by conventional medical approaches. The implications for MedTech's research portfolio and clinical partnerships could be revolutionary if Rosa's methods proved effective with larger patient populations. The corporate response to Rosa's proposal was immediate and overwhelming in ways that Connor hadn't anticipated. Within 2 weeks of Dr. Williams's official evaluation report, 3 major hospital systems in Atlanta had requested detailed consultations about implementing Rosa's music therapy protocols in their stroke rehabilitation programs. Emory University Hospital wanted to collaborate on formal research studies. The Georgia Department of Health expressed interest in funding pilot programs that could be expanded statewide if initial results proved successful. Medical schools throughout the Southeast requested opportunities to observe Rosa's techniques and incorporate them into their rehabilitation medicine curricula. Physical therapy programs wanted to understand how musical interventions could enhance their conventional approaches to post-stroke recovery. Speech pathology departments sought partnerships that could combine traditional language therapy with the musical stimulation methods that had produced Samuel's breakthrough. Connor found himself managing requests for information about therapeutic innovations that had emerged from his own living room through the expertise of someone he'd almost overlooked entirely based on assumptions about education, social class, and the kinds of professional knowledge that deserved recognition and compensation. The irony wasn't lost on him that a company built on medical innovation had missed revolutionary therapeutic potential that existed within his own household. But the most significant transformation was happening in subtle daily interactions rather than corporate applications or research opportunities. Samuel's vocabulary continued expanding slowly but consistently, adding 1 or 2 new words each week as his confidence in communication grew, and Rosa refined her approaches based on ongoing observation of what worked most effectively. Connor learned to recognize the environmental factors that supported his grandfather's best communication efforts, and to provide those conditions consistently rather than sporadically. The relationship between them shifted gradually from legal obligation to genuine companionship, built on shared success in overcoming challenges rather than inherited duty or family guilt about previous neglect. Samuel could now express preferences about meals, television programs, and daily activities using single words or simple phrases that were perfectly adequate for practical communication, even if they didn't approach normal conversational fluency. More importantly, he could convey emotional responses: pleasure when Connor visited, gratitude for Rosa's care, frustration when something wasn't working properly. That restored his sense of agency and dignity after 3 years of being treated like someone whose opinions no longer existed or mattered. Rosa's program became a permanent component of MedTech Dynamics' research and development portfolio, with dedicated funding for a comprehensive clinical trial at Emory University Hospital that would test her methods with 50 stroke patients over 2 years. Her formal title became Director of Therapeutic Innovation, but Connor understood that her real contribution was demonstrating that clinical expertise often existed in places where conventional privilege hadn't thought to look for solutions. The inheritance clause that had seemed like such an unreasonable burden during months of failed conventional therapy had actually been Connor's grandmother, Rose's final lesson in recognizing value, regardless of where it appeared or how it was initially presented. She'd understood that effective leadership required the ability to identify competence even when it didn't match traditional expectations about credentials, background, or social position. 8 months after Dr. Williams's evaluation, Samuel could manage simple conversations about daily activities, express clear preferences about food and entertainment options, and most importantly from Connor's perspective, share stories about medtech dynamics' early history that no corporate records had ever captured. The words came slowly and required patience, but they carried the weight of lived experience and genuine affection that had been locked away for 3 years of silence. Connor learned more about practical leadership from those halting conversations than he'd absorbed from Harvard Business School case studies or McKinsey consulting reports. Samuel's stories revealed decision-making principles, relationship management strategies, and ethical frameworks that had guided the company's growth through decades of challenges that Connor was only beginning to understand. The MedTech Dynamics Board of Directors unanimously approved Connor's permanent appointment as Chief Executive Officer on the same day that Rosa's preliminary research findings were accepted for publication in the Journal of Music Therapy. The timing felt symbolically appropriate, marking the moment when Connor had finally earned the authority he'd inherited through birth, while Rosa received the professional recognition that her clinical expertise had always deserved. Both achievements had emerged from the same fundamental source: the willingness to recognize genuine competence regardless of initial assumptions about who possessed valuable knowledge and who deserved opportunities to apply it. Connor's business leadership and Rosa's therapeutic innovations had both required setting aside conventional expectations about credentials and social position to focus on what actually produced positive results for people who needed help. Connor still visits his grandfather's room every morning at 9 o'clock, maintaining the routine that Rosa established during those crucial first weeks, when Samuel's recovery seemed impossible to everyone except someone with the training and insight to see possibilities that conventional medical expertise had missed. Samuel still responds better to musical communication than to ordinary conversation, still requires environmental controls to achieve his best verbal expression, still measures his progress in individual words rather than complete sentences. But the silence that had seemed so absolute and permanent 3 years earlier has been replaced by meaningful connection, built one carefully chosen note at a time through the patient application of knowledge that existed in places where privilege hadn't initially thought to look for it. The mansion on Peachtree Road now fills regularly with sounds that had been missing since Samuel's stroke. Not just words, but laughter, music, and the kind of comfortable conversation that happens between family members who genuinely understand and appreciate each other. The lesson Connor learned wasn't complicated in its basic principle, but it had been expensive in terms of time, money, and missed opportunities before Rosa's arrival made the teaching impossible to ignore. Competence exists everywhere in society, but recognizing it requires actively setting aside assumptions about who deserves attention and what legitimate expertise looks like when it doesn't match conventional expectations about education, credentials, and social background. Connor's grandmother, Rose, had structured the inheritance clause specifically to teach that lesson, understanding that effective leadership in any organization requires the ability to identify and utilize talent regardless of where it appears or how it's initially presented. Rosa Martinez had provided the practical demonstration that made the teaching stick, showing that the most valuable people in any situation are often those whose qualifications don't fit standard expectations, but whose insights can solve problems that conventional approaches cannot address effectively. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happen not through expensive equipment or prestigious credentials, but through the patient application of knowledge and care by people who understand that every individual deserves the chance to be seen, heard, and valued for who they really are beneath the surface of their current limitations. If you want more true human stories, hit subscribe and stay with us.